Y'all know, whenever we're on vacation or something, and I blame it on the kids, I like to go places that serve food that's entertaining. Y'all know what I mean? Like whenever they're real little, you take them to see the mouse. What's the pizza? Chuck E. Cheese, and you go to. There's one restaurant that I went to, and I can't remember the name of it, but it smells like bleach when you walk in, and they have these guys that jump off of a high dive right in the middle of the restaurant, and they do some kind of acrobatic feat, and they dive in, and that's a lot of fun. All of the animatronic characters that you see sometimes. There's one that we went to not too long ago. I say that, it's probably been 3 or 4 years, but there's this big elephant head, and every once in a while it moves, and if you're not expecting it, it can scare you while you're eating, and that's what everybody wants when they're eating, isn't it? There's a story in the Bible about Jesus feeding 5,000 people, and they had been entertained. They have seen some incredible things that Jesus is doing, and now he's going to serve them this meal. So let's read this text. Sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee, that is, the Sea of Tiberias. And a great crowd of people followed him because they saw signs he had performed by healing the sick. Then Jesus went up on a mountainside and he sat down with his disciples. The Jewish Passover was near. When Jesus looked up and he saw this great crowd coming toward him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" He asked this only to test them, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. Philip answered him, "It would take more than half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each one of us to have a bite." Another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. "Here's a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. But how far is that going to go among so many?" Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." There was plenty of grass in that place, and they sat down. About 5,000 men were there. Jesus then took the loaves, he gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted, and he did the same thing with the fish. When they had all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, "Gather the pieces that are left over. Let nothing be wasted." So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. After the people saw the sign Jesus performed, they began to say, "Surely this is the prophet who has come into this world." And Jesus, knowing that they intended to make him king by force, withdrew himself to a mountain. As I researched this story, one thing that surprised me was that there are only 2 miracles recorded in all 4 Gospels. One is the resurrection of Jesus. After he died and was buried, he resurrected to new life. And then the second one is this. And if the Holy Spirit led all 4 of these gospel writers to put this in their letters, then there's got to be a reason. So I want to examine this story a little bit further this morning. Matthew tells us that the crowds followed Jesus on foot from the towns. And whenever Jesus saw the crowd, he had compassion on them, and he healed their sick. And then Mark tells us Jesus had compassion on them because they were with sheep. They were like sheep without a shepherd. So Jesus spends his whole day healing and teaching, and before long it started to get late, and so Jesus then asks Philip, "Where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat?" Here Jesus draws attention to this problem, and then he sets them up for a learning experience. And he gives them this impossible problem, and then asks them how they're going to solve it. And then he not only solves the problem because they didn't have the right answers, but he gets them involved in the solution. It's interesting to me that, not in this text, but in another account of this story, he has the disciples sit down in companies of 50s. He has the disciples order the people to sit down in companies of 50s. And it would be really interesting to me if they would tell us the total count of people, because all it says is that there's 5,000 men. So imagine this massive gathering of people sitting in 50s, And then Jesus is going to start handing out food to the crowd, or he has his disciples hand out food to the crowd. And then everybody is full, and they begin to pick up all the leftovers. Now the baskets, do you realize how many baskets there are? There's 12. And I know that you probably grew up in the church and you've heard this before, but this week it actually dawned on me. There's 12 baskets, and there's 12 disciples, 12 apostles. One for each of them. And I was telling Michelle this earlier this week, and she came up with an interesting idea. She said, I wonder if they got to take the baskets home. And maybe they put it up on a shelf somewhere so that they can see this. You know how we put things up, trophies or whatever. Something to remember the event by. I thought that was a really neat thought. Now, what does this story mean for us? I think that this was a test. I mean, John chapter 6 says that Jesus said this to test Philip. And now what I find interesting about this test is that Philip didn't give a really good answer. Philip's answer was, well, don't you know how much that's going to cost? That's going to cost a lot of money, right? Maybe his answer should have been, Jesus, I've seen you do some incredible things over the past few days. I know you can take care of this. So what is your solution to the problem? That might have been a better answer to that. You know, you're going to be tested from time to time. And during those tests, it's going to be easy to focus on our own inabilities. Like Philip. He said, that's going to cost too much money. So he focused on his own inability. He focused on his own limited financial abilities instead of focusing on God-sized possibilities. God uses these tests, I think, to shape our faith, to put a fire under us, to make us grow. And whenever we miss out on that lesson, sometimes He reminds us. Sometimes He reminds us of the lesson so that we remember what He's done in our lives. And I wish I had a basket. You know, maybe we all should buy ourselves baskets and put them up in the house somewhere to remind us of the God-sized possibilities whenever we find ourselves in a problem and we feel like we have limited abilities. That would be a pretty neat trophy to put on the mantle or something. That's what happened in this miracle of the feeding of the 5,000. In the book of Matthew, we read this. When they went across the lake, the disciples forgot to take bread. Be careful, Jesus said to them. Be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. They discussed this among themselves and said, is it because we didn't bring any bread? Aware of their discussion, Jesus asked, you have little faith. Why are you talking among yourselves about having no bread? Don't you perceive? Do you not remember the 5 loaves for the 5,000, or the baskets that you gathered, or the 7 loaves for the 4,000, and how many baskets you gathered? Neil said this morning about connecting the dots. Jesus expected the disciples to connect all of these dots, and whenever they failed to connect the dots, He had to remind them of what He had done. You know, we don't see as many miracles as the apostles did, like feeding the 5,000. We don't see as many things as the people in Jesus' day saw. I mean, there's a lot of people in here, there's a lot of people out there and in here that have experienced some pretty amazing things. God has done some earth-shaking things in the lives of people. Some people have overcome alcohol addiction or drug addiction. Some people have witnessed a dead marriage become alive. Some people have witnessed a person who is, their lives aren't on the right track, but God takes it and He puts them on the right track and makes something incredible out of it. And you might think that, well, nothing like that has ever happened in my life. So maybe God can't use me as well as someone who has had an incredible experience. But It's not true, and here's the reason. Consider the story about feeding the 5,000. It's a wonderful miracle, but the next day, the crowd then goes and searches for Jesus. Do you know why they were searching for Jesus? They wanted more bread. They wanted more food. But they didn't really want Jesus. Jesus talks to them for a while, and he tells them these things that they really need to hear and they really need to believe, but then they just walk away. Look in John 6, verse 66. It says, "After this, many of his disciples turned back and no longer walked with them." As long as Jesus was giving them physical bread, they wanted to follow. As long as they were getting this physical bread, then they were content in ignoring the real bread of life. He had done this powerful miracle in their presence, but it didn't make a bit of difference because sometimes miracles have a limited lasting effect on people. I believe I was healed from cancer a long time ago, 24 years ago. And I prayed that God would remind me every day about what He had done in my life. And so He gave me this bald head. I went through radiation and it burned the hair follicles on top of my head and it never grew back. So I look in the mirror in the mornings and I remember God answered that prayer. I remember I went through this experience. But you know what? There's days that I see my bald head and don't think a thing about it. And I just go through my day just like it had never happened. I think that it's a trap for us whenever we think that we need more miracles. I think it's a trap for us that whenever we think we need more exciting stories, whenever we think that if we just had the right preacher, then people would come and they'd stay. If we just had the right leadership, then they would come and then they would stay. If we just could see somebody raised from the dead, then they would come and they would say. If we had these wonderful, exciting, and powerful things happen in front of us, we may think that people are not going to walk away. I don't think it's true. Because what will draw people and what will keep people isn't more excitement, it isn't more miracles, it isn't more fireworks, and it's not more bread. But what is going to draw people and keep people is to make them hungry and thirsty for Jesus. I read the story of this woman who put an ad in the paper and it said, "I lost 50 pounds. I'm selling my clothes. They're still in good shape." She was bombarded with phone calls, but nobody wanted the clothes. Do you know what they wanted? How did you lose 50 pounds? Right. They wanted to know the secret. That's what they focused on. They were hungry for what worked for her, and that's what we need to focus on as well. We need to focus on why and how Jesus works for us. How has He made a difference in our life? What has changed? And if people are hungry for what works for us, they're going to be hungry for Jesus because that's who we hunger for. John 6:35, Jesus said, "I am the bread of life, and whoever comes to me shall not hunger, and whoever believes in me shall not thirst." And making people hungry for Jesus is less about the dramatic and powerful stories. It's less about the miracles, and it's more about telling people what Jesus means in our life and what He has done for me, what works. Listen to how John does it. "That which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our own eyes, which we looked upon and we touched with our hands, concerning the word of life, the life that was made manifest. And we've seen it, and we testify to it, and we proclaim to you the eternal life, which was with the Father and was made manifest to us. That which we have seen and heard, we also proclaim to you, so that you too might have fellowship with us." In other words, it's all about telling people what you have seen. It's about what you have heard. It's about the difference that God made in your life so that other people may believe the same way that you do. Believe in Jesus the way that you do and have the relationship that you have with Him. One last thing I want to say this morning. I struggled this week. If you're close to me, I've probably talked to you about it. I've struggled this week with the question of what can I present to this congregation from the story that is deeply meaningful and is deeply thought-provoking. And here's what's been baking in my mind all week long. Let's see if you can follow me. One of the key focuses in this passage or in this story, in this miracle that Jesus performed, was to tell people that He is the bread of life. And as I was reading this feeding of the 5,000 in all of the other Gospels, something caught my attention. In Matthew, we read that Jesus ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. And taking 5 loaves and 2 fish, He looked up to heaven and said a blessing. And then He broke the loaves. He gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowd. And then I remembered this passage from Luke where Jesus was eating His last meal with the disciples before His crucifixion, and we call it the Last Supper. We're told that Jesus took the bread, and when He had given thanks, He broke it, and He gave it to them, saying, "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." And then I remembered something that was said about the worship of the Christians in the days of the early church. And in Acts 2:42 it says, the first Christians devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship and to the breaking of bread and the prayers. And then there's this story about 2 men that were walking to Emmaus, and you remember that story. Jesus had been crucified, and 2 men were very upset. They feel like the Messiah had been killed, and all of their hope is gone. And then Jesus shows up, and they don't recognize Him. He's walking with them. They don't recognize Him. They just figure He's a fellow traveler who hadn't heard the terrible news that Jesus was crucified. And so they walked and they talked together. Jesus begins to tell them about what the prophets predicted about His death, about His burial, and about His resurrection. And then they sat down to eat. And Jesus broke bread. He took bread and He blessed it, and then He broke it. And their eyes were opened. The dots connected. They finally understood. They recognized Him. They saw Jesus in the breaking of the bread. Really, they saw Jesus in the breaking of the bread. That's the purpose of communion. Every single Sunday when we gather for communion, our goal is to remember, and our goal is to see Jesus. One of these days, we're going to get back to where we can break the bread. I mean, I like the little oyster crackers, and maybe they're suitable for keeping us from spreading germs or whatever. These people saw Jesus in the breaking of the bread. And I look forward to getting back to that. That's just personal preference. Robert Tinsky was reared in Judaism, but over time he became dissatisfied with the teaching that was going on. He felt like there was something missing. He just wasn't getting it all. So for the first time, he decided to go to a Christian church, and they were like us. They served communion every single Sunday morning, but he didn't really understand that, and so he asked some young people that were sitting beside him, and he said, "Tell me about this. What are you doing with this communion?" And then they took the bread and the wine and they presented the gospel message to him. And he was so astounded, and he was astounded and amazed that Jesus would give His life so that we can be set free. And then he was equally impressed with the idea that that Jesus instituted this reminder that lives on and on and on, and that we participate in so that we can remember and we can see Jesus in the elements. The story is told that he eventually became a faithful preacher of the gospel. Robert Tinsky became a preacher, became a Christian, because he saw Jesus in the breaking of the bread. That's what the story of the 5,000 means to me. I hope that you've learned something new from this miracle today. Maybe you have, maybe you haven't. I hope that this message has given you some things to think about through the week. I hope that you think about Jesus. Most importantly, I hope that the Holy Spirit has given you eyes to see Jesus more clearly. It may be through the breaking of bread. It may be something else. Maybe a basket on your mantle. Maybe, I hope that you're able to see Jesus more clearly and follow him more closely throughout your week.